Welcome to Crime Story with Camila, where we dive deep into the most chilling and mysterious true crime cases. If you love real-life crime stories, make sure to like, subscribe, and share so you never miss an update. Your support helps us bring you the most in-depth investigations and untold stories. On Christmas Eve in 1945, in the quiet town of Fayetteville, West Virginia, something inexplicable happened. Something that has haunted America for over 75 years. The Sodder family home caught fire. By morning, the house was gone, but so were 5 of the family's children. What makes this tragedy truly haunting isn't just the fire, but the fact that no bodies were ever found. Tonight, we dive into one of the most unsettling, unsolved mysteries in American history, the disappearance of the Sodder children. George Sodder, a hard-working businessman originally from Italy, and his wife Jenny had raised 10 children in this home. That night, the house was alive with excitement. Christmas decorations lined the walls. Presents were stacked beneath the tree. Laughter echoed through the rooms as the children begged to stay awake just a little longer. According to Jenny Sodder's later statements, the family finally began winding down close to 10:30 p.m. The older children were allowed to stay up later than usual, playing with new toys upstairs. George, exhausted from a long day of work, checked the doors, turned off the lights, and went to bed. Nothing felt unusual. Nothing felt dangerous. At approximately 12:30 a.m., Jenny was abruptly awakened by the ringing of the telephone. On the other end of the line was a woman Jenny didn't recognize. She seemed to be asking for someone who didn't live there. In the background, Jenny heard laughter and the sound of glasses clinking, as if the caller were at a party. Before Jenny could question her further, the line went dead. Unsettled, Jenny checked the house. Everything appeared normal. The doors were locked. The children were asleep. She returned to bed, unaware that this would be the last moment of normalcy her family would ever know. Just 30 minutes later, Jenny woke again, this time to the smell of smoke. As her eyes opened, she saw flames licking up the walls, spreading rapidly through the lower level of the house. Panic set in instantly. She screamed for George. The fire was already roaring, fed by dry winter air and the wooden structure of the home. George and Jenny rushed to gather the children sleeping downstairs. 4 of their children escaped into the freezing night. But when Jenny began counting heads, her heart dropped. 5 children were missing. They were still upstairs. George attempted to reach them, but the staircase was engulfed in flames. He ran outside, desperate, trying to retrieve the ladder usually kept against the house. It was gone. He rushed to his trucks, hoping to drive closer and climb to the second-floor windows, but neither vehicle would start, something the family later said had never happened before. Within minutes, the house collapsed in on itself. By the time the fire burned out, Christmas morning had arrived, and with it, a mystery that would haunt America for generations. As the flames finally died down, the Sodder family stood in silence, staring at what remained of their home. By the early hours of Christmas morning, nothing was left but ash, twisted metal, and charred debris. Firefighters would not arrive until hours later. The nearest fire department was understaffed, and attempts to reach them during the blaze had failed. By the time help arrived, there was nothing left to save. Then came the moment that would change everything. When officials searched the remains of the house, they expected to find the bodies of 5 children. They found nothing. No bones. No skull fragments. No traces of teeth. The official explanation came quickly. Investigators claimed the fire had burned so intensely that the children's bodies had been completely cremated. But to George and Jenny Sodder, that explanation made no sense. Experienced fire investigators later acknowledged that house fires rarely reach temperatures high enough to destroy human bones entirely, especially in an open, collapsing structure like the Sodder home. Metal objects, appliances, and household items were still visible in the rubble. Even portions of the home's foundation remained intact. If the fire hadn't destroyed everything else, how could it have erased 5 bodies without a trace? Only days later, the shock deepened. The coroner issued death certificates for the 5 missing children, listing the cause of death as fire or suffocation. No autopsies were performed. No physical remains were recovered. To the Sodder parents, it felt like a case being closed without answers. Their grief quickly turned into suspicion. George Sodder openly challenged the official conclusion, demanding further investigation. But local authorities insisted the matter was settled. The fire, they said, was accidental, possibly caused by faulty wiring. Yet, even that explanation raised questions. The Sodder home had been recently rewired, and an electrical inspector had declared it safe. George knew this because he had argued with power company workers about it just months earlier. As days passed, no remains surfaced. The ashes were left undisturbed, and the town moved on. But the Sodder family could not, because without bodies, there could be no burial, no funeral, no closure. Instead, George and Jenny were left with a single, terrifying possibility. What if their children had not died in the fire at all? In the days following the fire, what initially appeared to be a tragic accident began to look like something far more disturbing. As George Sodder reviewed the events of that night, detail by detail, too many things no longer added up. The first red flag was the telephone line. Investigators initially suggested the line had burned in the fire. But weeks later, it was discovered that the wire had been cut cleanly, not melted. A repairman later confirmed it had been severed intentionally, well away from the house. Then there was the ladder. George kept a long ladder leaned against the Sodder home, a ladder he used regularly. On the night of the fire, when he desperately needed it to reach the upstairs windows, it was gone. Days later, it was found discarded down an embankment nearly 75 feet away from the house. The mystery deepened with the family's vehicles. George attempted to start his coal trucks to drive closer to the house and rescue the children through the upstairs windows. Both trucks inexplicably failed to start, despite working perfectly earlier that day. They would later start without issue. Then came the witness accounts. Several people reported seeing strange activity around the Sodder home that night. One neighbor claimed to see balls of fire being thrown onto the roof shortly before the blaze erupted. Another witness reported seeing the missing children inside a car leaving the area as the fire burned. But perhaps the most unsettling account came from a woman who said she saw 5 children matching the Sodders' description at a roadside diner the next morning, accompanied by 2 men and 2 women. According to her, the adults appeared hostile and refused to let the children speak. None of these leads were aggressively followed. Adding to the family's suspicions were prior threats. Months before the fire, George Sodder had openly criticized Italian dictator Benito Mussolini, which angered some members of the local Italian community. One man reportedly warned George that his house would be destroyed and that his children would pay the price. Even more troubling, that same man later served on the coroner's jury that ruled the fire accidental. By early 1946, George Sodder was convinced of one thing. This was not an accident. Someone had planned the fire. Someone had sabotaged their escape. And someone may have taken the children before the flames ever reached them. But proving it would be another matter entirely. As public attention faded, the Sodder family refused to accept the official version of events. With local authorities insisting the case was closed, George Sodder took matters into his own hands. In early 1946, he hired a private investigator, C.C. Tinsley, a former insurance investigator, to conduct an independent search for answers. What Tinsley uncovered only deepened the mystery. One of the first discoveries involved the coroner's jury that had ruled the fire accidental. Tinsley learned that at least one juror was a man who had previously threatened George Sodder, warning that his home would be destroyed because of political disputes. Despite this, the man had been allowed to help determine the official cause of the fire. Even more troubling was a rumor involving the fire department. Tinsley was told that firefighters had discovered a human heart in the rubble and quietly buried it elsewhere. When confronted, the fire chief later admitted the heart was actually beef liver, placed in the ashes so the family could believe remains had been found, a decision that would permanently damage trust between the Sodders and authorities. In 1949, George Sodder pushed for the site to be excavated. During the dig, investigators recovered several small bone fragments. For a brief moment, The family believed they finally had answers. But forensic analysis delivered another blow. The Smithsonian Institution examined the bones and concluded they belonged to a person aged between 16 and 22, older than the missing children, and showed no evidence of fire exposure. In other words, they could not have come from the Sodder house fire. Once again, the trail went cold. Despite repeated requests, authorities declined to reopen the case. To them, the matter was settled. To the Sodders, it was far from over. Without physical evidence, without reliable witnesses, and without official support, the family found themselves fighting a system that seemed determined to forget what had happened. But George and Jenny refused to let their children be forgotten. And so, they made a decision, one that would turn their private grief into a public appeal for truth. For George and Jenny Sodder, the case did not end when authorities closed their files. It did not end with a death certificate, and it certainly did not end with unanswered questions. Instead, their search for truth became a lifelong mission. With no help from law enforcement, George Sodder decided to make the mystery impossible to ignore. In the early 1950s, he erected a massive billboard along Route 16, just miles from where the fire had destroyed their home. Displayed across the sign were the faces of 5 missing children: Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny Irene, and Betty. Beneath their photos was a bold message offering a cash reward for information leading to their recovery. Day after day, thousands of drivers passed that billboard. For decades, it stood as a silent accusation, a reminder that 5 children had vanished, and no one had ever explained how. Behind the scenes, the Sodders chased every lead. They traveled across the United States following rumors of sightings, to Florida, Texas, and other states where people claimed to have seen children resembling their own. Each trip ended the same way, with disappointment, but not defeat. In 1967, more than 20 years after the fire, a mysterious envelope arrived at the Sodder home. Inside was a photograph of a man in his early 20s. On the back were handwritten words that read, "Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie. Ill boys. A 90132. The Sodders believed the man in the photo strongly resembled Louis, one of the missing children. George immediately sent the photograph to the FBI. The Bureau attempted to trace its origin and the meaning of the cryptic message. Their investigation led them only as far as Kentucky, where the trail abruptly ended. No identification was ever confirmed. Still, for Jenny Sodder, hope never faded. She wore black clothing for the rest of her life, a visible sign of mourning and belief. Belief that her children had survived. Belief that one day they might come home. George Sodder passed away in 1969, never knowing what happened to his children. Jenny lived another 20 years, continuing to maintain the billboard and speak to reporters until her death in 1989. By then, the Sodder children had become more than a family tragedy. They had become one of America's most haunting, unsolved mysteries. As the decades passed, authorities maintained a single conclusion: the Sodder children died in the fire. According to official reports, the blaze was accidental, possibly caused by faulty wiring or an electrical malfunction. Investigators stated the fire burned long enough and hot enough to cremate the children's remains completely, leaving no trace behind. But fire science tells a more complicated story. Experts note that open-structure house fires rarely reach temperatures capable of fully destroying human bones, especially when the fire burns for a relatively short time. In countless documented fires across the United States, skeletal remains are almost always recovered, even when homes are reduced to ash. In the Sodder case, investigators found no teeth, no bone fragments, and no skull remains belonging to children, an absence that continues to trouble forensic analysts. Then there were the inconsistencies. Authorities dismissed eyewitness sightings of the children after the fire as unreliable. The cut telephone line, the missing ladder, and the malfunctioning trucks were all ruled coincidental. No formal kidnapping theory was ever pursued. The FBI briefly became involved in the 1950s, but their investigation was limited. Without physical evidence or proof that the children crossed state lines, federal jurisdiction ended. The case was quietly closed. Yet questions remain, questions that have never been answered. If the children died in the fire, where are the remains? If the fire was accidental, why were safety measures sabotaged? If witnesses were mistaken, why were their accounts never fully examined? Some researchers suggest the possibility of arson, followed by abduction, that the children were removed before the fire intensified. Others argue the simplest explanation remains the most painful one, that the children perished and the evidence was lost forever. But without proof, certainty is impossible. What remains is a case suspended between two realities, one accepted by officials and one haunted by doubt. And in that space between explanation and uncertainty, the Sodder children remain missing.
Thanks for watching. For more interesting videos, please subscribe.